Good morning. I speak to you from the land of the Wapo, the first peoples of Napa Valley, and I thank them for their hospitality. And of course, I am very grateful to AC Books and visionary founder Holly Crawford for publishing my first novel, DoveLion. So to hear me means I can share the title's correct pronunciation. It's a more phonetic DoveLion versus the combination of dove and lion that spell it out. Reine Marie Melvin and I are going to talk about my novel and then open it up to the audience. And I am blessed indeed to be in conversation with novelist Reine Marie Melvin, who's known to her friends as Bonnie. And so we are going to call her Bonnie from here on. She is an award-winning novelist whose works have been anthologized in the US, the Philippines, France, and who's received 2 of the Philippines National Book Awards for fiction. And I'd so admired her last novel called The Betrayed, because it reminded me of what Jose Garcia Villa once said about poems, which is that every word needs to be necessary. The writing in Bonnie's novel, The Betrayed, was so fine and elegant, I kept waiting for the words to falter, but ended up amazed that they maintained their refinement. So I'm glad to be in conversation with her because she played a key role in my novel. I had asked her for input on my novel because she was a successful writer, but I hadn't realized that she also is a professional editor, and she ended up giving my manuscript the type of attention that a so-called development editor would give to a manuscript. And I lucked out since I was a newbie novelist and someone who wrote my novel without input from others, like a writing group and or going through writing workshops. So thank you, Bonnie, for joining us from France. And everyone should look for her novel, The Betrayed, which is from Ateneo de Manila Press. Good morning, good evening, Bonnie.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely, lovely introduction. I read the book in manuscript, and I read it again, and I was utterly enthralled. And I think one of the first questions I want to ask you, knowing how much you've published over 60 books, and you've said that this novel was almost 2 decades in the making and 4 years in the writing. So I wanted to know, what's the background? Why did you write this novel? What made you want to write this novel? And what's the backdrop, the background for giving birth to this beautiful book?
It was 20 years in the making. I should back up a bit and talk about the novel's plot, because it has a discernible plot today. It's about this poet, Elena, who immigrates to the United States as an adoptive orphan, and later raises a family who would overthrow the dictatorship in her birthland, the country of Pacifica. And after overthrowing the dictatorship, she discovers that she's the last remaining member of an indigenous tribe that had been thought to be genocidally destroyed. And so her family is actually the seed to resuscitating the growth of that tribe. The country in my novel is the fictional Pacifica, a territory known as DoveLion in earlier times. Pacifica is presented as sharing the same territory as the Philippines during indigenous times. As time unfolded, a portion of the shared land split, and Pacifica separated to become its own island nation. So there's an overlap between the 2 countries' cultures, as they used to be one. This plot, however, was not intended by me when I first began writing the novel in this version in 2016. I developed DoveLion as a poet rather than as a novelist, which is to say I placed my trust in the writing process and wrote the novel as a result of seeing what happens when I wrote under 3 arbitrary constraints. The first one The first was to write every day on the novel during the year 2016, which is when I began and ended the first draft. The second constraint was to begin each day with the phrase "once upon a time," a phrase I chose because I didn't know at the time what the novel would be about. So I thought of that phrase, which, you know, begins many stories, as it turns out, many fairy tales. And the third constraint was to keep the action focused on a simple movement, that this protagonist, Elena, was coming out of an underground subway stop in New York to walk towards an appointment in a nearby building. So an example beginning would be, once upon a time, I left the dimness of a subway system to break out into daylight. So this novel is actually an example of writing within constraints, like Oulipo, if folks know about that French tradition. Because constraints, I find, don't necessarily limit, but instead end up becoming freeing as they ground the imagination. So I began by exploring how long I could write with these constraints, which inevitably fell away when the novel began to write itself. And so you asked what the 20-year reference is, that because I wrote this in the same way that I would write a poem, I would relate to my poetry philosophy. I feel that my key task as a poet is to educate myself on as many topics as possible, whether or not those topics actually interested me, to practice education for education's sake. And I would learn those things whether or not they interested me, because I don't want my writings to be limited by the limits of my experience or imagination, because the world is more diverse and large and various than my own paltry personal concerns. This education then forms a root source for what I can apply in my writings. And so the beauty of this approach is that while I'm trying to get away from the limits of my personal life, what actually surfaces from the unconscious into the writing are nonetheless those topics and elements that concern me. And so it turned, as it developed, DoveLion then came to reflect my long-held interests in art and poetry, or aesthetics and poetics, in power, the machinations of power, in the history of my birthland, the Philippines, my criticism of, as well as anguish over, the Ferdinand Marcos martial law dictatorship, as well as the psychology of orphans, among other things. And to those who don't know, I happen to be an adoptive mom, and in the process of international adoption, I had had a chance to meet a number of orphan kids. So their plight is very close to my heart. And part of what came out in writing DoveLion is that it went back more than 20 years ago, actually, to a paper I had written as a college student when I was a political science major. And there I had written about how the conflict of interest in Philippine development, that the political elite is almost also the same as the economic elite. And that's a conflict of interest because, you know, if you're a politician, as a politician, who also is wealthy, you're trying to preserve your wealth. But if you're a responsible politician, you're actually supposed to be increasing the wealth of everybody and not just your family or clan. And so that notion, and which we still see, is a major hamper on a economic progress in the Philippines, came up as well in DoveLion. So basically, you know, I try to write from nowhere, and I end up anyway focusing on what really concerns me. And that's my general approach in poetry, and I applied it to the novel.
As you know, I'm not a poet. I love poetry. I'm not a poet. I love novels written by poets because I love language. I love the language, the compression, etc., etc. So when I came to your novel, when I started reading the novel, I thought it was going to be beautifully written. I thought it was going to be experimental, intellectual, intriguing, etc., etc. What I did not expect is that you've mastered the narrative tropes of a novel. It's got a narrative engine. It moves, it moves, it moves. It's got character development, and you've sustained that over how many pages? 300 pages. So I find that really very, very, really exciting. And I'm just wondering, how did you've written fiction before, you've written a book of short stories, you've written, what is it, 13 novels in 130 pages. You've written, could you tell us a little bit about that and tell us how that may be linked to the novel that you've written now? Because it's still a very, very different form to write 300 pages as opposed
Yeah.
to you've written before, the shorter forms.
The short answer is I was trying to overcome failure here. Indeed, the reason why it took so long to write a novel is that the scale of this long form novel, as you know, is just overbearing. And I had to actually mature into learning how to do it. And then what happened about 5 years ago is, at that point, I'd also, as you know, been writing as a poet. I just finished this poetry project called Murder, Death, Resurrection, that in summary professes to create an infinite number of poems if the poet is up to it. And it was hard. That was, I thought, a great project, but it was hard for me to beat the greatness of it. And I was trying to think, what else could I do after having created a project that could create an infinite number of poems. And then I was reminded of my long held goal of writing a long form novel, about 45, 46 years old. And I realized doing a long form novel would take years. And actually, if I was going to do that, I needed to start now. I needed to start then. And so I thought, okay, one last chance at it. But I said I'd also matured into it, not just psychologically, but as a writer. And so what I learned from doing short stories and then doing the collection of 7-chapter novels to which you allude, these are short form novels. They're very all short. Each novel is 7 chapters, and some chapters are literally 1 sentence long. So what I learned from that was lyrical compression. So I applied that to narrativity, which is how I had mostly done short stories, and came out with, as you know, the more experimental but emotional form of DoveLion. Quite often experiments have this simplistic reputation of being cold. And I wanted this to be the opposite of cold. I want hot. And how to maintain this heat over 300 pages. I couldn't have done it earlier than in my life. I wasn't up to it. But I still had to maintain the discipline, and it was the constraints. There were times during the year when I would falter and think there's nothing else I can say about this novel. But then once you write the phrase "once upon a time," it's a trigger, and you moved on.
Interesting.
So,
yeah. Okay, speaking of hot in another sense, not the sense that you're talking about, it's an extremely erotic novel, I find. The first, I'd say the first...
Probably a surprise to my husband, but yeah.
I'd say the first third, about the first 100 pages, it's once upon a time, but basically it's once upon a time, this amazing character, Elena, who's sensual, smart, broken, fiercely moral, lost. Once upon a time, she emerges and she goes to an apartment in a gray building, and it's the apartment of a stranger, Ernst, and they have these incredible sessions that are extremely erotic, but that also cover everything. They talk about art, its politics, but there are very, very strong encounters between them. And there's domination and submission. There's the whip, there's pain, there's blood, and there's love. You do that very, very well. You talk a lot about desire, but you talk a lot about the curiosity, the vulnerability, the loneliness. And she just keeps going back. And a lot of the tension in that first 100 pages, like what's going to happen? We're talking about the anticipation of Elena as she goes to see Ernst, his anticipation as he's waiting for her, but the reader's anticipation, because we don't know what's going to happen. So much happens in that room. So I wanted to ask you, why is eroticism what's the role of eroticism in the book for Elena? Because she's changed by that, and in your whole concept of the book as well.
Because I generally think my writing is political. I once had a dream, and I don't know who this person was, but I, in that dream, identified that person as a quote unquote political poet. And in that dream, that person told me, never underestimate the power of eros
in politics. That in the book, yeah.
Right. And so that's how it came out in the book, was actually from a dream. And then the other instigator would be something that I stumbled across when I was doing my education for education's sake. I read several years ago an article in the New York Times about this club in Japan, in Tokyo. It was a club that was comprised solely of a four-walled room. And all that happened in it was that powerful Japanese men, they powerful in the sense that they're leading politicians or presidents of companies and other powerful men, they all go to this club. They strip down, they put on oversized diapers, and they hop into these oversized baby carriages. And then they are pushed around the edges of a room by ladies who are dressed in the stereotype British nanny costume. I guess that's the black with the white frilly apron. And all that happens in this club is that these men are being pushed around in this oversized diapers, in this oversized baby carriages around the room. And they would pipe in maybe some soothing music. And what that was about, I frankly laughed. I thought it was so weird. I laughed, but then I thought about it. And then what that is about is, if you think about it, someone who's usually working in a powerful position, it must be very freeing to let go of any responsibility such that you revert back to being a baby. It must be so freeing and so pleasurable that it becomes sensuous and then erotic in a way. And yet all happening is that they're just being, strolled around in this private club in our room. And the eras there, that made me think about, if I'm going to infuse my writings with eras, I should do something more interesting than, if you will, normative sex or normative romance. And the notion, and as I thought about what those Japanese men were experiencing, well, they were submitting. They were submissives in the sense that, whatever, they did not control what is happening to them, unlike in their normal days when they usually are in control. So in this sense, they were being submissive. And so that led me into doing a submissive dominant psychology. I learned about it and then infused it in my writing, which, by the way, for those who are not as versed into it, dominant submissive psychology is not the same as sadomasochism.
No.
I just want to put that out there. And so that, therefore, again, I want to, in my writings, whether it's a poem or certainly this novel, I want to have an intimacy with the reader. And I want that intimacy not to be a surface intimacy. I want it to be deep, to be heated. And so eros, and then unusual types of eros. And that's how it comes out, yeah.
And one of the great sources of the erotic tension between Ernst and Elena is the political tension, is the political context, because I don't know how much I want to give away of the plot here, but he's there because she's searching the mysteries of her past and like what happened to her family. He's directly involved in that. So it's a very, very intriguing thing. But just going back to the political side of the novel, because it is a very fiercely political side, and you really do make very, very strong commentary on the country like the Philippines, the structures there, the colonialism, the corruption, the dictator. Yet you've made the choice not to name the dictator. You haven't named Marcos, and you mentioned the Philippines, but you don't name the country as the Philippines. And I'm just wondering why you made that choice, and whether you hesitated about that, or it was always clear for you that you would not mention it directly.
I had two reasons for doing that strategy. The first is that the Philippines that I know and that I was born into and grew up in, which was basically the 1960s, because I left the United States and immigrated in 1970 to come to the United States. That Philippines is lost to me. And we have today, it's not a country that I know. And so I didn't want to write about it without having learned more about it, including much research, including what would be required travel back to the Philippines. Without that kind of research, I don't feel comfortable writing about the Philippines in the same way that if I don't research any topic, I wouldn't feel comfortable writing about that topic. And the other reason is more of a selfish literary strategy. I anticipated, because that's just how I write, that once I begin to write, there'd be this energetic flow. I would want that anyway. And I didn't want to have that flow be interrupted by stumbling across gaps of knowledge and then having to stop and check it out and that. I wanted, ideally, I would have written, even though it's over 300 pages long, ideally, I would have written this book as its first draft in an uninterrupted time. Of course, you can't do that logistically, but I wanted that flow. And so that's why I decided to not cite Marcos or the Philippines directly. But as it turns out, it became, in my opinion, a more effective work as a result of that.
I think so too.
Because because when I'm citing persons and events, for example, this dictator's kid had lousy grades at her college. That's really citing,
everyone knows, yeah.
Everyone knows that Ferdinand Marcos's kids did not have good grades in the colleges that they claim to have graduated from, and things like that. So it became very mischievous and sly on one level, and it was a lot of fun to do it in that manner.
Yeah. And you have your footnotes. I have another question. I don't know if we have time for it, but it's about
probably one more. Yeah, just one more.
Okay. And I'm very interested in hearing you talk about how you structured the book in terms of time, what you call the kapwa time, how past, present, and future existing at the same time.
Yes, that actually, yeah. That is my favorite element of the structure, the idea that there is no past, present, or future in this novel. It's all happening in the singular now. And that was inspired by N.V.M. Gonzalez's idea of the mythic Filipino man, where if you happen to see this person, he called it man, but this person standing, and that person had his hand raised up to the sky. From a certain angle, if you took a snapshot, it would look like that person was rooted both to earth and sky at the same time. And in that moment, that person is connected to everything and everyone across all time. And so I wanted that, and that's what I mean by kapwa time, because kapwa, of course, is the Filipino indigenous cultural trait of interconnectedness, and everyone is related to everybody else across all time. So I wanted to present a novel that was writing within that kapwa time. And so, as you know, each section has a date but the year is not specified. And even the dates are not in chronological order, because it doesn't matter, you see, it all happens at once. That was the idea. And so that balancing was tortuous to me as a writer. I mean, it was just, I mean, this thing is the most difficult thing I've ever done as a writer. I mean, just, whitened my hair and all this crap. But that's the point of art. You're suffering through it, but you do it anyway because you're compelled to. So, yeah. No past, present, or future. It's all now. So, yeah. Oh, but believe me, I have a long stack of to read lists.
Well,
And,
you don't have to.
I'll get to it.
I was just asking, but I mean, he's a German philosopher who wrote in the mid 20th century, and he's the one who coined the terms that were later made popular by Ken Wilber about the archaic, magical, mythical, mental, and integral structures of consciousness. And one of his main thrust of his work is about how this era that we were coming into is all about the eruption of time and going into this timeless form where linear time, which is really mostly an illusion, is done. It's exploded really. And so what you're doing, gosh, it's just I can't express how exciting it is. I can't wait to read it. And you're very good at articulating about what you're doing too, and you're mirroring your artistic process. And thank you, Bonnie, too, for just it's a scintillating dialogue the two of you had. It was really exciting to listen to it. So I just
An
Thank
exciting
you, Glenn.
book. It's really an exciting book, and it's a
uh,
romance. it's
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah, no, and I'm very excited about it. I want to do something similar later in my life, so I'm really interested to read this, to write novels that are outside of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn. And when I was talking about education for education's sake, you remind me that, I mean, there was a point in time, but this is over 10 years ago, which is why I'd forgotten about it, where I believe I read all of Ken Wilber's books that had come out at that point. And I don't know, maybe some notions of his infused whatever I was doing in the novel.
And I'm very fortunate to have had the chance to read the manuscript, but it reads very differently in the final version. So, but what strikes me about this novel is that your character is indigenous. She is actually a Baylan, the medicine person in um, the Filipino indigenous culture. So I was wondering, the novel kind of ends with that revelation, but it doesn't really go any further than that. It doesn't describe what the indigenous culture is like, or what it was like, or so. How do you? So, reading it end that way, I'm already seeing a sequel. Like there should be a sequel to this to show how the Pacifica can be indigenous again. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, the novel has three parts, and part three is the section that goes into Elena's discovery that she is the only remaining member of this indigenous tribe that we call the Itonguks. And then the ending of the book does end with them rediscovering their culture. But as you say, I don't go into many specifics of what the Itonguk culture is like. I do, except for one moment, which is when I say that they all have to be poets. They have to write poems. Yeah. They have to write witness poems. In other words, they have to do good And that's the only way that they can write about that particular topic. They first have to do good for their community or the environment or something like that. But except for that element, I don't describe the Itonga culture. And that was deliberate because I wanted the sequel, as you put it, to be created by others, not me as the author. This, by the way, is the strategy that's typical of my poems. I love the open-ended poem where you end a poem and it's up to the reader what that poem's significance is. So for my novel, I wanted the interested readers to be the one to imagine and perhaps do something with, well, what would this Itonga indigenous culture be like? One person who responded to this question gives me an example that I love, which is, he said, well, if the Itongas have to be poets, they have to write poetry, then maybe when a person dies, instead of a eulogy, what happens is that people read their poems, because that would reasonably illustrate what that person was about, because that person would only have written poems on things that were of interest to him or her or them. And so things like what would make up dance, music, and other parts of the culture, how you engage with people, education traditions, what would those be? Ideally, I would like those who are artists and poets and others, actually anybody who reads the book, to then also answer a question: what do you think would be a good element to be part of this Itonga culture? So yes, I wanted it to end with a beginning, because Kapwa time, there's no ending or beginning, it's all one. So
Eileen, it's Barbara and Harry.
hello, you
Can you
guys.
hear us?
Yes.
We were just saying, we were with you and Tom when you wrote that first sentence, and you were so exhilarated, and it's just wonderful to be here for your book launch, and we can't wait to get the book. Very exciting. Congratulations.
So Eileen, it's Luke. Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah. So from what I've been hearing, you're writing a fantasy novel.
It could be a fantasy novel if you all make it that way. Yeah.
Okay.
It has that flexibility, right, Bonnie?
Can be, it's everything. It's everything. Yeah.
What were your inspirations? It sounds like you have you're writing an epic poem and a novel at the same time. Did you get your inspiration from the Mahabharata?
More likely Star Trek. You know, the
Really?
whole concept and vision of Star Trek, of going out there into unknown worlds and meeting people who are outside of your preconceptions of what a creature would look like and be like. Loved that, all that. Yeah.
So you're talking about the Philippines, but not directly talking about it.
No, because I've realized with the novel that an overriding concern of mine as a writer is power and the machinations of power. And that transcends any one country. We see that all around the world, as you know. So yeah. But of course it applies the Philippines. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I also, as you know, want to encourage attention to the Philippines and what's going on there. I just had to do it slant because,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be ordering your book today. Okay.
Thank you.
It's actually quite a devastating critique of the Philippines, of the structure of the political and the economic structure of the Philippines. It's not called directly the Philippines, but it's very strongly written. And you have your footnotes, which explain a lot of the context, which are fascinating. Like I read the footnotes as if they were a separate chapter. They were, and the poem at the end was amazing. I love too the poetry that you've put into the book. It's beautiful and it works really, really well.
Thank you.
It's a gift.
Dated endnotes in a book is highly unusual.
Yeah,
I mean, it
exactly.
crosses between fiction and nonfiction when I read the manuscript and found it interesting.
Someone was asking me about this because they were calling it autofiction. And again, I was saying, it's not so much that, but again, part of Kapwa, if you are connected to anything and everything, is I wanted the book to be like in the theater when actors step off the stage and go amongst the audience. So I didn't want to avoid the presence of real life historical elements, and so I wanted the footnotes absolutely to be there. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean as an autobiographer, semi-autobiographical, biographical, but it was just unexpected in the novel, and you could see it was like this combined structure, which was interesting.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Eileen.
Hi.
And Eileen was my editor for my poetry book. This is the first time we've met.
Yes, it is. Nice to see you.
It's great to see you, Eileen. So I'm thinking how I love novels that have poetic language. And a lot of times I'll read something and I'll say, well, where's the language in this? I lose interest, but I really wanted to hear more from you about what that transition was like from writing poetry and then to suddenly write a novel. I mean, to me, that just would be so overwhelming to learn a new craft, especially since you said you didn't go to workshops, you didn't go to classes. So how did you make that shift from one genre to another?
Because I read a lot, and I read a lot of novels. And as a person, before I became a writer, I was reading these huge Russian novels. And I remember carrying these huge tomes around when I was in, let's see, 8th grade. Of course, my fellow students thought I was odd, but I didn't care. I loved these big, thick Russian novels. And it wasn't so much that I could understand everything that was being, that I was reading in them. It's just that I was so impressed by the physicality of these huge hardcovers, these big books, these big thick books. So I looked at them and said, you know what, I want to make one of those someday. And as you know, since we're published by the same press, one of my Marsh Hawk Press books is this collection called I Take the English from My Beloved. And it is over 500 pages long. And I remembered what I love about Marsh Hawk Press is its ability to be innovative too. And usually, as you know, most poetry collections are slim. They said, go for it. And the reason is that they call it the brick, that particular 500 plus page poetry collection. I did that deliberately because I didn't know if I would ever write a big, thick novel someday. But in the meantime, I also wanted to talk back against the idea that a poetry collection has to be thin, But I just love the physicality of big, thick novels. And so how did I write a novel? By reading a lot of novels. And how do I write poems? By reading a lot of poems. So yeah, just that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi, Eileen. It's Justine.
Hello, Justine.
I am so happy and excited to be here and to be listening to you and your process. It's very inspiring. And so what I actually just want to know is the selfies. I have seen your selfies for I don't know how long you've been writing, and it's every time I see it, I go, oh, there goes Eileen. She's still writing her novel. And for me, it always seemed it. Not that I was on Facebook every day, but it's like a little thing. Somebody out there is keeping at the goal, and for me, that is such a big thing to think about because sometimes I lack the pushing towards the goals. So I'm kind of curious how you came up with the idea of doing selfies in regards to the making of this novel. Did it have anything to do with the concepts that you were pursuing in this novel, or was it what was it about the selfies process?
Right. So Justine is referring to the fact that when I began writing the novel, I commemorated, I recorded that on Facebook, my progress. I would record my progress on Facebook with an accompanying selfie. I used the whole notion of putting public, making public my writing process of a novel, where I announced in January, I'm writing a novel, and for the rest of the year, I would say, I've done this much, I've done this much, this bothered me, etc. Until I got to the end of the year, when I showed an image of the manuscript with the words "the end" at the bottom. That was the year 2016. The whole concept of that was, I didn't know in the beginning whether I would succeed in writing a novel, but I wanted to put as much pressure on myself to succeed in writing a first draft, because prior to 2016, I had never succeeded in writing a long form novel. I made copious attempts. They would all falter. I would take the more successful chapters, and if lucky, I would turn them into standalone short stories. But I'd never succeeded in writing a long form novel. So I wanted to put pressure on myself to achieve it this time. And I thought, you know what, you'd feel humiliated if you failed at this at the end of the year. So do it that way. Succeed, otherwise you'll be humiliated. That's what I was telling myself. As regards to the selfies, that actually was I was disputing selfies. I have to admit that I loathed the whole idea of selfies. I thought that, I mean, I get why people do it, and people, you're all beautiful, but I thought there was a downside to all this selfie taking. So I decided to do selfies for the first time, really. But in putting forth selfies, I wasn't doing, Kim Kardashian type selfies. I would show myself with off, if I said this was a bad day of writing, then I'd show myself like, like that. I was disputing the notion of artificial beauty making selfies while I was doing the reporting of the writing progress. I mean, I like layered projects. So if I want to do XYZ, I also want to keep adding as many layers on top of that, so that the whole thing at the end of the project is a multi-layered project beyond the 3 layers of XYZ. It also goes into that. So that's how I approach that.
It's Sheila. Your book is in the mail, so I have not read it yet, but I'm so intrigued, and I love your poetry. And my question is, I heard Bonnie talk about character development in your novel, and you talked a little bit about how some of the characters, or one of the characters, came through you through a dream or a particular moment in the novel.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about whether or not you kind of, I was wondering how you inhabited this character, how you were able to develop a character. This is something unusual in poetry. We don't have, we have speakers, but we don't really see a character development per se. And so I'm wondering how you did that, or can you talk a little bit about how your characters develop?
Right, and I suspect that how I approached it is not, I don't know, traditional or normative. Because I inhabited these characters in the way I think I'm not supposed to, which is through language. The reason why I'm very free with talking about what the novel is about, that it's about this. The reason why I don't mind doing that is because I feel I don't really give anything away until you read it. Because the language of the book, I'd like to believe, is of a nature that its own particular way of writing itself. It's not something that one can summarize. You actually have to read the thing. So I can tell you that it's about this poet and this dictatorship and all that, but when you read the language that unfolds the story of this poet and the dictatorship, hopefully you'll be as taken with the words and not just the story. So in trying to strengthen the resonance and the lyricism of the words, I think I inadvertently strengthened the character development. And that, again, obviously is more of a poetic point of view than not poetic.
I was just going to say, if I could have a follow-up question, especially if the novel itself isn't structured in time per se, so that it has a certain timeliness, I would think that it would be even more challenging to develop a character that's out of time, out of sequence with narrative time. So, if you could speak a little to that, that would be great.
Right, and I was aware of that, and I realized that, when you're talking about time, Kapwa time, and in order to avoid the pitfalls of what you just raised, I decided that the narrative, as you read the words, also have to have a logic as if they were linearly unfolding, even though they were occurring at different times. And maybe I simplified the tactic by just using dates for each section that are not chronological and lacking the reference to years, so you don't know which March of 2010 or March of 2009, you don't know. You just know it's a March of some year. So I tinkered with the references to time and dates, but I didn't actually disrupt the linear narrative that could unfold through the words. You'll see that when you read the book. Yeah.
Well, yes, I would.
Hi, Sheila.
Can you hear me okay? Yes, hi, Eileen. This is really exhilarating. I'm so enjoying your comments and the questions and your responses. I just wanted to say that I guess I'm a little bit luckier than some because I ordered the book the minute I heard about it. So I have begun it, and it's just a thrilling read, even in the early stages. From the poetic standpoint, there are many statements, questions, and so forth that are just capturable poetic moments that are very powerful and beautiful. And I get the sense from what you share, Eileen, that what happens is of probably less import than the everything happening at once and the characters emerging as they do. And I'm saying several things at once, I guess, but the power of your discipline and clarity of thinking and breadth of thinking comes through in a really crystallized way in the reading. It's an extremely exciting thing to read, and I'm moving right on with it. But I sense that how you work and how you perceive makes this a very unusual novel, and it's a really great one. So I guess it's more a comment, but if anything you'd like to say about that would be great.
Thank you. And all of your remarks are mean a lot to me, Sheila, because I know that Sheila is a discerning reader as well as poets. What I will say is that I think that I want to work from a certain impossibility, which is to know everything that exists about the world. And you, of course, that will be impossible to achieve, but you try to learn. And just by the nature of all this consistent learning, you end up with personally unanticipated sources of metaphors and other roots for your own creation. It's an exhausting but exhilarating ride. And so I'm happy that someone like you saw that in DoveLion, because I will tell you all right now that had I not pulled off this particular book, I would have been so devastated. I probably might not have continued writing, because it was that meaningful to me. I think it's the best thing I've ever done. And I know that in my heart. And so I also know that had I not pulled it off somehow, I don't even want to think about that possibility. And this is also one reason why I'm so grateful to AC Books, my particular publisher. I mean, this publisher is helmed by artists. And I think they saw something that more traditional publishers might not. And so I feel very blessed and lucky to have this relationship.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eileen. This is very exciting. And I don't know that any form could contain you. So that's a good thing. That's why. And if you would even consider stopping writing, I would be personally driving right over there and trying to persuade you to change your mind. So, please stay with it. It's all very rewarding. Thank you.
Eileen, thank you for the comment. And yes, I'm an artist and I've written different around, but I should also, I read it. I really liked, but I gave it to my husband, who was reading Russian novels at a very early age too, and is a voracious of fiction. And I have a tendency to read, poetry and more nonfiction and all different areas, and then, some fiction. And so, yeah, this merger, and you were the first interested in my thing is institutional and political cultural critique. So it fit into, it broadened me, because I realized, well, yes, it still fits into the things I'm interested in publishing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
And I guess that sort of wraps us up, and thank you for everyone coming. Hazel designed the book. She's not here. She's our full-time book designer, that and I let her have pretty much latitude, and she did draw the cover.
Beautiful design.
He is an artist with a BA, and I like space in books, in the sort of black pages and the whole thing. So I just don't put out something that's blank. It's like it has to be almost an art form itself, the design.
Yes,
So.
and I think Hazel did a great job. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Hi, this is Catalina Cariaga. I came in late. I told Eileen I'd be late.
Yes. And Katie, of course, is one of our unheralded but brilliant poets in Americas.
And we just finished an interview. Hopefully that will be put up on Poetry Flash. And Eileen does discuss DoveLion. And so that's really cool. And they sold out a small press distribution already.
I know. Yeah. They shipped more on Friday. More were shipped. They're going to have a whole another batch on next week.
Awesome.
Hi, Mama Eileen. I just want to say hi and say congratulations. This is Ayo.
And this is a lady who is sleepless in the Philippines, I believe, because isn't it like 4 a.m. or whatever? Thank you.
2 a.m.
2 a.m.
Mama Eileen, I just have a question. I have a question for you. Like, what do you think will be the reception of the Filipino people when they read the novel, as compared to the international readers or audience?
I have no clue, because I actually am not the go-to writer for many Filipinos, because I'm always I'm not writing the kind of more discernibly Filipino take on in my writing. So I have no clue how to answer that. I hope it's positive, certainly. Yeah. Well, except that if you're a supporter of Marcos and the current regime, maybe you wouldn't be. In fact, you wouldn't be positive, and you shouldn't be, because I criticize the hell out of you guys.
I have yet to read the novel and I'm excited
Yeah.
about it. Congratulations,
Thank you.
Mama Eileen. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, Ariel.
Hi, Eileen. It's Sri. And, you know, I think there's one thing you said that was wrong today. You said this is the best you've ever done. Everything you do is always the best you've ever done. So I'm already looking forward to the next one. And
I appreciate.
I've enjoyed your poetry for, geez, close to 30 years. And so I'm looking forward to reading this and all your future work. And congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's Reese Hessling, who is one of Massachusetts poet laureates and also a wonderful poet. I also love him because I believe he may actually be the first poetry editor to ever accept and publish a poem by me. I've never forgotten Zvi in the 1990s or 1980s. I submitted something to his Muddy River Poetry Review, and he actually followed up with a phone call. I mean, who does that nowadays? So I appreciate you, Zvi, and thank you for being here all these years. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And, you know, I put out an online poetry magazine called Muddy River Poetry Review, and you've been featured in there a couple times, and people just love your poetry. And that's, you know, you're more of a universal person than I think you realize.
Thank you, Zvi.
I like to hear the dogs barking.
And for everyone that I think I had closed it off, thank you for coming. For everyone, the books are SPD in the United States, and it's John Rule is our distributor in the UK, and so Ireland through all of Europe. He has books there. Those books are printed in the UK, and so they are available. Books are widely available, and they're not just the United States. And again, thank you and we'll be posting the link to this because it is being recorded. So if anybody missed anything, they can see it. Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Eileen.
Thank you, Hall. Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much.